Connected in 3D, Real-Time Solutions and Digital Twins podcast with your host, Ashley Crowder.
Welcome to Connected in 3D, Real-Time Solutions and Digital Twins. I'm your host, Ashley Crowder, the co-founder of Ventana. I've been working in the 3D space for over 15 years, helping IT leaders and business executives manage and deploy 3D at scale to increase speed to market, reduce costs, and improve sales, training, and maintenance. And I get tons of questions around digital twin and real-time 3D technology. So I started this podcast to bring on my incredibly talented friends who are experts in various areas of 3D technology to help explain how this technology can be used today to accelerate your business and how it will change your business in the near future. So I am so excited today to have Will Gibbons. He's a designer with a passion for teaching and sharing knowledge about 3D rendering and animation for product designers and engineers. His mission is to elevate the quality of product visuals created by designers within the industrial design community. So, Will, thanks so much for joining us.
Yeah, the pleasure's mine. Thanks, Ashley. I appreciate being here.
Yeah. And so we'll just jump right in. You know, your career spans industrial design, freelance rendering, and online education. Can you share your journey into 3D rendering and what initially sparked your passion for this space?
Yeah, absolutely. So I actually studied industrial design in college. So I went to school for that. My hopes was to join some of the top industrial design firms and work on all sorts of different projects. And that didn't go as planned. Life had other plans for me. So I actually ended up working in the bicycle industry directly after college. And oddly enough, that kind of segues into where I ended up. And that's because there I was doing what we called industrial design communications. It wasn't a role they had, but one that was kind of created. Their engineering team had a lot of great technologies that they would build into these bicycles that the consumer may not actually be able to see because they were material science or aerodynamics, things you can't visualize necessarily. My job was to learn the technical side of what they did and then communicate that in a way that was easy to grasp for consumers. I did this through illustrations and technical drawings and writing. And that's kind of what I teach today. It's really to communicate ideas, technologies, benefits, which helps sell products. And so from there, I ended up getting into rendering because I kind of needed to do that to create some of those visuals. And once I learned about KeyShot, it was a very accessible 3D tool. I dove deep into that and eventually ended up becoming the global training specialist for KeyShot, which meant I would train other design teams and engineering teams. So even though I didn't get to work on a big range of products for a company doing industrial design, I did work with a lot of industrial design teams, and I taught them how to do what I do today, which is 3D rendering.
Super cool. You know, they always say when one door closes, another one opens, and then you kind of end up in something that you never even thought of, but might even be a better, career move. So that's pretty cool. And then kind of taking one step back, I know we talked a little bit before the podcast of how the terminology has been confused a little bit in the market. And so, what do you define as 2D rendering versus 3D rendering? Let's kind of set the terminology clear.
Yeah, so it's a great question. This is kind of my definition, what I've come to understand working with my friends. But again, I think it kind of depends on who you're going to ask. A lot of marketing teams are going to work. So if you go back to traditional media where you have print ads, anything printed is going to be 2D. It's an image that's obviously meant to be printed. Those used to be done by hand, illustrated. And when I studied industrial design in college, we would do what we called rendering. And that could be done with markers, pens, ink, gouache, charcoal, pastel, whatever. The rendering really was the image that you used to present an idea. It was different than a photograph, which was the actual physical object existing and then captured. So the rendering was the kind of almost like concept or the visualization, the idea before it was produced. And that was done digitally, before it was done digitally, it was done by hand. And we call those 2D renderings, at least within my education from a formal standpoint. Now that we have technology that allows us to create CAD or 3D models, we can take that data, which is far more accurate than someone's hand-drawn rendition of a product, and then we can add realistic materials, finish, lighting, etc., and then we can make that look real, just like the photograph. And that's the 3D rendering, because we're actually starting with an element that is three-dimensional data. Even if our final image gets printed 2D, that's like a flat media, really the distinguishing characteristics in my mind is kind of the starting point. Is it something that someone is drawing by hand, or is it something that is computer aided drafting design, CAD data?
Yeah, no, that's helpful, because when we think about 3D, I mean, we think about it as the highest level asset. You can automatically generate whatever content you want from that 3D model, whether it is a 2D image, video, GIF, etc. And so sometimes when we are talking with people, they're referring to it as 2D rendering because they're getting a 2D image from a 3D asset. But yeah, I agree. It gets all very confusing. So for this purpose, a 2D image made from a 3D model is a 3D rendering. So we're all clear.
Yes, and to elaborate on that too, the beauty of our 3D data is that we can turn it into so many different experiences. I can take, with the same software, create those animated GIFs. I can create video files, even interactive web say turntables that as you're scrolling down a website, you can see that rotate. So there's a lot of outputs we can do, but what they all have in common is that they're all image-based. They're all a final image that the rendering software spits out.
Right.
So yeah.
Right, exactly. No, it really is incredible. And when we work with businesses, that's the one thing we talk about is like, okay, well, how much does your photo shoot cost? Okay, how much did the video shoot cost? Well, if you're going to invest in building this 3D model, you can auto-generate almost all of that from this. So that's huge. And I mean, you've obviously been working in this space for a really long time. How have you seen the field of rendering evolve over the years, especially in the advancements in hardware and software tools?
Yeah. So I think what I've experienced is a speed up of initial idea to final output. And I think that what that allows us to do as creatives is to explore more ideas in less time and cover more ground. And I think that there's an interesting intersection where there are people, not unlike myself, who've spent a long time investing in a skill set that is then being semi-automated, or parts of it are being automated by new technologies, which can be scary and off-putting. But at the same time, if the human is the person curating ideas, exploring different avenues to pursue, and perhaps pitching lots of different directions, we can actually speed up that process and get to a much better final result in less time, more efficiently with the tools that we have. So at this point, we're not so much trying to chase photorealism anymore because it's largely achievable. Whereas before, it was this getting closer and closer to realism. Now that we're kind of there, it's more, how can we take everything that we have produced and do more with it, ideally?
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. And you hit on a good point. I mean, with AI, everyone's kind of worried about their jobs, but I agree with you. AI helps you get 80% of the way there in some cases, but you're still going to need that human and that creative eye to get exactly that final product that you want. Yeah, so there's no reason to be afraid of AI. I agree. It's just going to help speed up everyone's process, but humans are definitely still needed. Your work often features stunning 3D renderings with KeyShot. How has KeyShot transformed the way you create renders? And are there any new tools or features that have really excited you?
Yeah, so KeyShot is what we call a standalone render engine. And there are a lot of tools out there that are capable of producing great 3D rendered content. And the reason I've been using KeyShot and still use KeyShot is because it's a tool that's made to be accessible by anyone who uses CAD. And if we're going to get nerdy for a second, I'll try to keep it simple, but you have these two separate worlds that I like to divide into entertainment design and then product design. Entertainment design is going to be tools and pipelines and technologies that are used in video game and VFX and film, things like that. In the world where we are taking engineers who produce CAD data that are going to be manufactured by machines and then sold globally around the world, those are going to be a different set of tools, and they inherently, it's basically like a different language. And so the software we use to do the rendering needs to be able to ingest all that data and work nicely with it. And that's where you have kind of this fork in the road between entertainment design and then product design. KeyShot is a tool that's made to work really well with this CAD data and also be very user-friendly. It's like a very easy tool to pick up. So naturally, the industry has kind of adopted that. And since I have roots in industrial design, I still kind of serve that core group of users rather than entertainment design folks. So that's why I've used that tool, and that's why it's great for what we do.
Yeah, no, and that is such a good point. But it is interesting that more and more industries are starting to adopt game engine technology. And so we are starting to run into this issue of, to your exact point, game engines were not necessarily built for CAD data like Siemens NX and SolidWorks. And that's one of the things, at Ventana, we really focus on solving, because game engines are so powerful and can do so much for creating digital twins and simulation models and so many things. But I think that's a really good point. If you are looking into doing renders of your products, really think about, where is the 3D design file coming from, and is it compatible with the rendering software like KeyShot you might be choosing? And so then
The other thing, if I can mention, the other thing that, just to put a button on that, there's this idea that it's an either or. And what I've seen is a lot of the clients and groups I work with, it's a little bit of both, where the designers and engineers during the product development cycle are the ones using KeyShot. But then if they're going to have a pretty big ad budget to, say, create a television commercial, they will then have usually another studio that will use a different set of tools. The only downside is you want to make sure that your design is fully locked to the point where it's actually being produced, because they're going to need to rebuild whatever CAD data you have in an entirely different software. And that's a pretty costly process, but not necessarily not worth it. It's just a matter of being able to see what the final result will look during the development process is really useful. And it just so happens the tool I use is great for that.
Yeah. Well, and conversely, Ventana actually solves that part. So, we can automatically optimize and convert whatever CAD data you have to meet whatever specs you need, because of this growing need for sales and marketing to get 3D assets into real-time rendering type environments, where typically, in the past, you would have to rebuild them because those CAD files just are way too big, have too many polys, just too massive in size to even bring into those engines. But now we're really seeing it's possible. And so that kind of leads me into, with the rise of 3D augmented reality and real-time rendering, how do you see, rendering staying relevant? And are there ways you've seen both mediums complement each other? Because I know when we're talking about KeyShot rendering, we're really talking about the post-processing, right? So you're hitting render, the computer's thinking for a while, and it's spitting out the images or videos that you're creating. Whereas in real-time rendering, it's literally real time. Though, there are some limitations with that still today.
Yeah, absolutely. So as you said, there's going to be different tools that excel at different areas. KeyShot is a progressive real-time renderer, so you do get real-time feedback. It is going to not be in its completely finished state all the time. It might be a little bit grainy as you rotate it, and then the longer it sits, the more clarity it picks up. And there are also various modes you can enter. KeyShot has tried to kind of solve a few of these problems by having lower render settings that can then approximate what you would see in like a game engine that is a little bit less photorealistic, if that makes sense. But if you're going to do a lot of like immersive sort of exploration where you want to, hop in a car and walk around it and interact with it in that sort of way, then you're more wanting to rely on, like you said, something like a game engine type software for that. As far as the staying relevant, if you're primarily working with a tool that is not super heavy into the real-time rendering, most companies are going to still use these for design reviews. So making decisions during the process of development, they want to see what it could look like if they made XYZ change or if they put on whatever materials. They're also going to want to create all the imagery for their packaging and their marketing campaigns and things like that. And depending on how complex your products are, there are some calculations that even game engines are not going to be photorealistically rendering. They're just going to be approximating or cheating. And so it really comes down to the fidelity you require and kind of the aesthetic you might want to create and whether or not that's easy to do in the tool you're working with. So I think at this time, it's become more common that people have a handful of tools instead of having to be, experts on one software. Thankfully, as tools get better and our technology grows, people can make room to become more well-versed in different tools, and hopefully they play together as well so that, as you said, you have your core asset that can then be used across several programs as needed.
Yeah, that interoperability is key to really helping make the case for 3D and rendering and helping your business. And then that kind of leads to, the point of real-time rendering still is not exactly photorealistic. Some things you can get a lot closer than others, and it really depends on what your goal is. But, when you're working with product renders, how do you strike a balance between artistic creativity and technical accuracy?
Totally. Yeah. So it's going to come down largely to what the goal of the client is, whether that's something I'm doing for myself or working with somebody else. And generally speaking, I can set something up that is as photorealistic or as technically realistic as possible. But then the beauty of having the software is we can bend the rules of physics a little bit as we need to. And it also allows us to, say, put the camera in a place a normal camera wouldn't fit. Or if you need to move in an animation in a way that just isn't really feasible, then you have those freedoms too. So I think that I like to try to lean on the tool and use creative decision-making to enhance, to try to create the best possible version of a product. The same approach in photography can be done, but it can also be extremely labor intensive where they are taking many, many images while moving lights on and off and then compositing those together to make one image. And and whether they're doing focus stacking, like with luxury, a wristwatch, for example, they have to take many, many photos to create that one hero shot, which could be basically built into a KeyShot scene where once it looks nice, I can hit render, and that's, like taking one picture essentially.
Yeah.
And so I like to start off with something a little conservative, but then also do some alternatives where we just kind of explore all sorts of different creative looks. And then it just really comes down to the taste of what the campaign or the image or the client needs in that case.
Yeah, you never want to. I always think about the models that are so photoshopped. It's like that human can't be real, right? But to your point, it gives you tools where we have a number of clients in the mining space where some of this equipment is so big. I don't even know how they got it into the Las Vegas Convention Center. I really don't. But it's so big, it is impossible to shoot because if you take a photo of it, you can't zoom in because you had to be so far away to get the whole thing.
That's right.
But with rendering, you can do the everything you want, which is really not technically possible in the real world, but the end goal is showing actually more accurately what that product is and what it can do, which is pretty amazing.
Yeah. I'm glad you brought that example up because I had worked with some companies, whether they were producing refrigerators or CNC machines, the larger the item, or cars, the larger the item gets, the more expensive it is to photograph. And that's where, because you need to essentially build a set around it, and then that has to have controlled lighting. And that is, as you said earlier, when you're comparing the cost of photo shoots to rendered content, it can get way, way expensive. And then the way I like to explain to people is the investment is a little bit upfront, the same way it would be with the photo shoot, because there's a lot of setup. But once you've got your file created, if 6 or 12 or 18 months down the road, you want to go and revisit that to make a tweak or bring the updated version in, you can do that and not only 100% recreate that same exact lighting as needed, you can expand the scope of that or, with very little additional cost. And not only that, if you switch photographers, they may not have the tools or the approach that the original photographer did. Whereas if everything's contained within a file, you can essentially hand that off to somebody else to pick up where you left off. So really, from a cost benefit analysis, there's definitely a lot of reasons people like to shift into the 3D space and start to replace some of those photo shoots, especially for like just e-commerce, which is like pretty basic. That's those are some of the considerations we like to think about.
Definitely. I'm working with a backpack company right now who they're changing their logo. So they're like, well, we either have to reshoot everything again, or why don't we just finally invest in 3D and then we can swap out the logo if it changes again, or we can just change the color of the bag, et cetera, which makes sense. And this is actually where just going back to AI could be really helpful. I mean, what role do you think AI will play in rendering, and are there opportunities or challenges you see?
Absolutely. So it kind of depends on how far out you want to look, but there are some, in my opinion, very low-hanging fruit that I would start to use AI ideally to try to see if it can help solve some of the bigger challenges that we face from a technological standpoint within the software. So, for example, with rendering, you've always have a time aspect. As you mentioned, real time is basically a different technology than photorealistic offline rendering is what we call it. And to really make it look truly photoreal, we are tracing photons throughout a scene, which is costly computationally. And so there are probably efficient ways or efficiencies we can pick up if we leverage machine learning and AI tools. And denoising is a technology that starts to do that, but there are probably other more elegant ways we haven't explored yet. And then there's also image and lighting, texture and lighting tools that could be developed as well. So as you mentioned, a backpack is an interesting example. Fabrics can be pretty hard to create in a seamless, tileable fashion. There are some ways to do it, but it can be fairly costly and labor intensive. And if you can take a small photo of a swatch of that material and then have a software rebuild it intelligently from that. And I know there are some tools that are starting to do that, but that can become way more sophisticated, faster, and easier than it is. And there's also the way, text to asset creation is a big one that is starting to happen. So again, let's say I'm going to render a room and I've got my product inside there. I don't want to spend money on all the assets in the room because it's kind of secondary to the product I'm working on. It would be great if I could basically select a surface, explain what I want it to look like, and then cycle through 5 or 6 options or 10 until I'm like, that's the one. And then it like creates a really, really believable version of that. That's where I would be looking into leveraging AI tools rather than what a lot of people think it is, which is to do all the creative work for you. It's actually take the tedium and the technological barriers away, freeing people who are creative to do what they love and were hired to do in the first place.
Yeah, I completely agree. And getting, all the props out of the way to the point. No, that's great. And yeah, at the end of the day, you're still going to have to work on your hero asset. And the other use case I read recently, which I'm excited about since we work with so many CAD type companies is auto-generating materials for the CAD, which is a little bit like the fabric you were mentioning, but also, there's only so many options of steel, iron, different metals. So it's definitely like a finite problem to be solved.
But even in the case of the technology that you guys are using, when you talk about having to take CAD data, which is what's called a NURBS-based, we'll call it a language, I guess, a surface, and then turning it into polygonal, a mesh, which is what those common other software that for entertainment design is typically using, to do so in a way where you have what's called good topology, which is like the arrangement of those polygons, so that then it can be used to create simulations or deformations or bending and stuff that are typically not done within the tools that product designers use. That's another way to leverage AI, because it can analyze the model and go like, okay, rather than having someone who knows how this is going to be used, we can make a good educated guess on how these polygons need to be rearranged so this asset is truly useful in another tool. And so that's where I really love the idea of using this software, this technology, I should say.
Awesome. And so jumping back a little bit, I know we touched on kind of this balance of reality versus bending physics to do different things. How do you communicate technical aspects of rendering to clients who may not have a design background? And what advice would you give to creatives working with similar clients?
Sure. So that's a great question, because typically there is a basic understanding that, hey, you're going to make our CAD models look like a photograph, the finished piece. And it's easy to assume that there's kind of this software and you hit a button and it's done. Great, you're good to go. And, it's getting easier, but there are a lot of steps that are involved to get to that really polished end result. And the best way I've had to do that is to kind of explain when I talk with somebody, kind of probe a little bit to understand what their technical level of understanding is. If they're a designer, then it's a lot easier. If they're in marketing and they've only worked with 2D assets, then it gets more challenging. And then at that point, I just like to kind of bring them through the process, try to break it into a few chunks. For example, you're going to have data prep, which is like everything before you start rendering. Then there's going to be like look dev, which is like you're going to present your idea, like a rough sketch of what this might look like. And then once that's signed off, then we need to make accurate materials. And then we have to do final like lighting. And then we need to actually render out the final assets. And then if it's an animation, you've got your post-production as well. And then you need to kind of wrap up the project, archive it, make sure it's like ready to be handed off to someone else or just archived on your own machine. Each one of those are kind of like a phase of the project, which is, 4 to 6 phases. And I try to make sure that someone understands that if I say I need 2 weeks or 4 weeks or 6 weeks, it's coming from the point of there are these phases that have to be done in order. And it's not a either or. You can't really remove any of them because the whole process, each step is kind of predicated on the previous one. So I think just, you have to be clearly communicative, but not get too in the weeds. And having a bit of an outline is a good way, kind of like a little reference sheet of like what to expect. I've done that in the past too. So that would be my suggestion.
Yeah, a basic project timeline can really help. Awesome. And I know we've touched on this a little bit, but thinking about the future, what trends or breakthroughs do you see in the next 5 to 10 years with rendering?
Yeah, I think you're always going to have people cutting down the time it takes to get to final image. I think that we're going to have more tools that help us explore as many avenues as possible. So even though it's maybe not in the rendering, generative image creation is great to describe kind of what you're looking for and then have a huge menu of suggestions. From there, it's great to start to kind of share those and have the decision makers kind of verify that they want to go in a certain aesthetic direction, which then prevents the user from making really costly mistakes building out entire scenes to then just be told, out of these 4 you just did, either none of them or one of them, that's a lot of wasted time. So again, efficiency is huge. The other technologies I'm excited about is, I think, again, text to asset creation, being able to say, hey, I need a vase that's 4 inches wide and 6 inches tall, and it needs to, be cylinder shape, and, kind of describe it, and then have your instant asset instead of having to painstakingly model the whole thing would be great. I don't think we are quite in a scenario where people designing and creating new products are going to be replaced with some of these tools, but I think anything that's going to help bring in efficiency and, also probably intelligent assets where we're connecting metadata and information to files. So instead of looking at an image and saying, well, this is great, but like, who made it? How did they make it? What were their render settings? How long did it take, et cetera? Having all that baked into our assets really help when you get into a larger organization and they're trying to, again, make decisions and also have lots of people participate on the same project. And I know there are probably tools also in Ventana that help with attaching data to projects and things like that as well, which is kind of similar.
Yeah. I mean, we automate like the tagging and metadata with an asset. And I think this gets into, I'm hopeful that real-time technology will get photorealistic, just with improved compute power and with AI advancements. And then, with real-time assets, you can store a lot of this data and update it in real time. So, like the OpenUSD is pushing their format, which Pixar uses, and that is a really complex file where multiple people can be working on the same 3D asset at the same time and store that information. I'm also a proponent of GLTF being a standard file format, which is the best for web. It can also store a bunch of metadata, but it's not really built as much for multiple people working on the same file. But yeah, we're living in a very exciting time. So, Will, thanks so much for joining us. For those inspired by your work, where can they find you?
My home base is willgibbons.com. Pretty simple. From there, you can find any of my creative projects I got going on.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining. This was so helpful to understand the difference between offline and real-time rendering and just the value of that for 3D. So thank you.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.